I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with and that I be allowed to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to talk about the fiscal challenges facing this country, and particularly the spending problem that we have and how it impacts not only the economy, but also the lives of the American people. Last week, the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office released the latest budget and economic outlook, which confirmed the threat that long-term fiscal imbalances pose to the nation's economy. The Congressional Budget Office found that the national debt will climb by $10 trillion to $26 trillion over the next 10 years if federal spending continues on its current trajectory. Spending on mandatory programs will remain on autopilot, resulting in high annual deficits. Now, just as to kind of put things in perspective, Mr. President, if you go back to 2007 and you look at what the federal government spent, it was about $2.7 trillion annually. And if you look at what the federal government spent in 2012, fiscal year 2012, which ended September 30th of last year, it was $3.5 trillion, an increase of nearly 30%. Now, inflation during that same time period was 10.8%, meaning that government grew at almost 3 times the rate of inflation. So, I want to emphasize what I think is an important point here, because in the discussion that we're having about spending and debt, there's this assertion that's been made that this isn't a spending problem, that actually this is more a revenue issue. Well, again, if you look at what's happened just in the past 5 years, spending has increased nearly 30%, federal spending, or at a rate of almost 3 times the rate of inflation. So clearly spending has increased dramatically just in the last 5 years. Now, the trend is projected to continue over the next 10 years and beyond, with spending exceeding its historical average over that time period and then ballooning in the years beyond that. Now, such levels of spending will cause the federal debt to grow, and according to the Congressional Budget Office, and I quote, "Such a large debt would increase the risk of a fiscal crisis, during which investors would lose so much confidence in the government's ability to manage its budget that the government would be unable to borrow at affordable rates," end quote. Again, why is this important? Well, obviously, if the deficits continue year after year after year, adding more and more to the federal debt, eventually investors are going to lose confidence in our government, and they're going to demand a higher return, higher interest rate when we borrow money. Well, that obviously has an impact all across the economy, because when interest rates go up, everything else that's pegged to it goes up. If you look at Americans, middle-class Americans who are trying to borrow money, for example, to buy a home or to get a college education or for a small business to make investments in order to expand and create jobs, the interest rates go up for everyone. Inflation also goes up if the nation's fiscal challenges are not addressed, meaning that hard-earned dollars aren't going to go as far. And that's going to put further pressure on hardworking middle-class families. Mr. President, the threat of the budget challenges facing this country are very, very real. And they face our economy because of this report that came out last week from the Congressional Budget Office. It confirmed, really, that we are headed toward Greece if we don't take the steps that are necessary to change the direction that we're on. That reality, however, unfortunately, is lost on a lot of people here in Washington, D.C. As I said earlier, there's been this debate about whether or not we do, in fact, have a spending problem in this country. Well, over the weekend, the Democrat leader in the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, repeated what has become doctrine to many in the Democratic Party, and that is the idea that the United States government doesn't have a spending problem. Of federal spending, she said, and I quote, "It is almost a false argument to say we have a spending problem," end quote. This comes from the top Democrat in the House of Representatives. It is almost a false argument to say we have a spending problem. Well, obviously, the White House scrambled quickly the next day to come out and say, yes, we know we have a spending problem, but there is reporting out there that suggests that the President of the United States has also made that assertion that this is not a spending problem. I don't know how you can look at take any examination of the federal budget projections and not to come to the conclusion that we have a spending problem, Mr. President, and it is driving our national debt. A debt is very harmful to our economy. And again, you don't have to look any farther than the Congressional Budget Office report last week to see that this really is a spending problem, not a revenue problem, because that same CBO report came out and said that the revenues, money that's raised by the federal government, is returning to its historical average of 17.9% of GDP. And that's the way we measure the amount of revenue coming into the Treasury as a percentage of our entire economy. You measure that over time, and getting back to the historical average, the 40-year average would be 17.9%. Well, if you look at the year 2015 as a case in point, the revenues get back to, in the year 2015, to 19.1% of GDP, which is a 25% increase in just 2 years, significantly exceeding the historical average. And if you look at the 10-year outlook, that the CBO came up with, they said that revenues would average 18.9% over the next decade, which is almost a full percentage point more than the 40-year historical average. The point, Mr. President, is this. Revenues are back up to not only at historical levels, we'll be there by 2015 and stay there for the next decade, but will exceed the historical average for revenues over the next 10 years. And so clearly, what we're talking about here is not a problem of Washington taxing too little. It is a problem of Washington spending too much. Now, I know that truth is hard and that math is hard to accept for the people who want to grow government, but we absolutely have to govern in reality. And what the math shows is that mandatory spending, which, as I said, is on autopilot, continues to squeeze the federal government and the federal budget to a point where we're going to face a Greece-style fiscal crisis if Washington continues to punt on the hard decisions that have to be made. Mandatory spending comprised roughly 60%, I should say, of federal spending in fiscal year 2012. And if you look at the big drivers of mandatory spending, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security alone represented 40% of that total, again, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Now, Congress and the administration have an opportunity in the coming months to reform these entitlement programs, not only to get this country back on a more sustainable fiscal track, but also to save and protect these programs, not only for current retirees, but for future generations of Americans as well. And that's why I was disappointed last night that the President, in his State of the Union address, failed to lay out a plan to address the fiscal challenges that our country faces. I hope that the President and my colleagues here in the Congress will come to the table and work with us to solve these problems, particularly as we consider ways to address the sequester, the continuing resolution which follows after that, and the fiscal year 2014 budget resolution. We cannot simply wait and watch these programs crumble under the weight of looming insolvency. We know that Social Security has operated at a cash deficit, did so in 2010. The Medicare trustees have told us that Medicare will be insolvent by the year 2024, and in the HI trust fund actually by as early as the year 2016. If we're going to keep the promises that we have made to current retirees and to future generations of Americans, we have got to make these programs solvent, Mr. President. That means we have got to reform them in a way that saves and protects them and make sure that they are fiscally sustainable, not only for today, but for the future as well. And I have to say that as I've listened to the debate about the issue of spending and debt, there's an argument that's made by those on the other side that, well, really this is just because of the two wars. And the two wars drove up spending, and they weren't paid for, and that's the reason that we have this $16.4 trillion debt. Well, obviously, the wars have contributed to that. But if you look at through 2012, that's about $1.4 trillion. And obviously, I would say, Mr. President, as well, to be fair, that Republicans have contributed to this as well as Democrats. When Republicans were in charge of the Congress, we didn't do a good enough job of keeping spending under control. But the fact of the matter is that even if you count in spending on Iraq and Afghanistan, that's about $1.4 trillion. Okay, well, the total debt now, as I said, is over $16 trillion, scheduled to go to $26 trillion 10 years from now. And over the course of just the first 4 years of this president's term, his first term in office, the debt has increased almost $6 trillion. So it's really hard to feature any objective analysis of these facts and this data and say that it was the wars that somehow caused all this. Mr. President, Washington has been overspending for a really, really long time, and it is high time for those habits to change. And I would also say, too, that if you look at the wars that's winding down, the costs that the money that we're putting to, or the resources that we're putting into those conflicts, those dollars are not going to be showing up again as expenditures in the next few years. And we still have the Congressional Budget Office telling us that at the end of the next decade, we'll have added an additional $10 trillion to the debt. So clearly, it's certainly been a factor, but it has not been the main factor, Mr. President. There is, again, no objective analysis of this that would suggest that, that spending on the wars has been the driving reason for why we are facing the debt crisis that we have today. And I would simply say, too, that when you are in a hole, it's advisable to quit digging. And obviously, we continue to look at ways to add more and more spending and therefore more and more debt. The health care bill is not something that anybody on my side here in the United States Senate supported when it passed in 2009 and early 2010, but that, too, is going to drive up spending and going to drive up debt as we head into the future. And you heard from the President last night a series of new spending initiatives, investments he called them, in a whole range of areas. And as he was sort of laying that out, those of us who were listening to that message were thinking to ourselves, okay, that if you had a calculator on this thing, it just keeps going, going, and going. And yet the President said we didn't need to add a single dime to the deficit. Well, I don't know how anybody could accept that with a straight face. It just flat doesn't pass the smell test. We have a spending problem here in Washington, D.C. The facts bear that out. Revenues are going up. They're going to go up 25% according to the Congressional Budget Office in the next 2 years. In 2015, they will be at 19.1% of GDP, an average that we haven't seen, or a number that we haven't seen in a long, long time, and then they will stay roughly at that for the next decade. This is not a revenue problem. This is not a problem where Washington taxes too little. This is a problem where Washington spends too much. If you look at the other side of the equation, spending continues to go up as a percentage of GDP. We see a little bit of relief here in the next few years, but then when the costs of the Affordable Care Act start hitting, when you start seeing the demographics of the country as they continue to change, if we don't do something to save and protect Social Security and Medicare for future generations, it is going to bankrupt us. We are headed for a train wreck, Mr. President. We have got to do something about that and recognize what that problem is. That problem, purely and simply, is that Washington spends too much. It is a spending problem, and that's why, again, when I heard the Speaker, or the top Democrat, the Minority Leader in the House of Representatives, say over the weekend that it's a false argument to say that this is a spending problem, I was shocked, because I think that most Americans would argue, as they look at this and they can do the math, Washington has a very serious spending problem which needs to be addressed. It needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. But I thought that the report that came out from the Congressional Budget Office last week was instructive, Mr. President, for a number of reasons. It pointed out the impact that debt is going to have as we face this debt crisis in terms of interest rates, in terms of inflation, in terms of loss of jobs, and a more sluggish economy. We know from history that when you get a certain amount of debt, it becomes such a drag on your economy that it reduces economic growth. And so we've seen this anemic, sluggish economic growth, which I think is going to be continued now for the foreseeable future. So we've got slower growth, fewer jobs, massive amounts of debt, and eventually what that's going to mean for the middle-class American in this country is higher interest rates when it comes to buying a home, when it comes to buying a car, when it comes to financing a college education. It's going to mean lower take-home pay when the economy slows down and there isn't the demand for workers out there. There are so many adverse impacts on our economy from carrying the kind of debt load that we're carrying today. And I think we have a responsibility to lead, and I hope that the President will lead, Mr. President, I would say the President of the Senate, but the President of the United States will lead on this issue, that he in his budget will put forward the types of remedies that are necessary not only to deal with our short-term crisis in the sequester, but also to put us long-term on a sustainable fiscal path by proposing reforms to these programs that are driving federal spending that are going to add massive amounts to our debt over the course of the next decade and beyond, and at the same time look at things that we can be doing that would generate economic growth that would create jobs in this country, because when the economy is growing and expanding, then all these other problems look much smaller by comparison. Republicans here in the United States Senate are ready to work with the President, work with Democrats. We're anxious to go to work on entitlement reform, on saving Social Security and Medicare. We're anxious to go to work on reforming our tax code in a way that would unleash economic growth and get that robust growth that we need in the economy to create jobs and make the debt crisis that we face look much smaller by comparison. So I just hope, Mr. President, in the days ahead, the President of the United States and the leadership here on Capitol Hill in the United States Congress will do what we should have done a long time ago. It's long overdue for action. It's high time that we got busy and got about the work of the American people, and that is providing a more secure, a more prosperous, a safer, and a debt-free future for future generations. Anything less is negating or is undermining the responsibility that we have to the American people. Mr. President, I yield the floor.